One autumn evening, Keanu Reeves was sitting in a cafe in the heart of New York City. A little girl entered the cafe and bought a piece of cake. What she did next deeply moved Keanu and left no one indifferent. Friends, let us know in the comments under what conditions you watch this video. In the background, while working, or during lunch. Also, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow another emotional story will be waiting for you. Autumnal New York looked like a postcard someone had soaked in tears. The evening sky was covered with cold clouds. The wind hurled fallen leaves across the cobblestones, and the city, always loud, seemed slightly slowed down. People hurried home, wrapped in scarves, with red noses and faces burning from the wind. Only cafes, those warm islands of light on the cold asphalt, remained full. In the very heart of Manhattan, between a bookstore and a flower kiosk, nestled a small cafe, with a sign barely hanging on its hooks and the scent of cinnamon that followed passers-by for half a block. Into this cafe stepped a man the whole world would recognize, but that evening, he was just a passerby in a dark hood. Keanu Reeves. He appeared silently, like a ghost. The door jingled, but he moved so calmly, so slowly, as if afraid to break the space around him. His hair, slightly damp from the rain, beard imperfectly trimmed, eyes, with the same depth cinephiles recognize instantly. But in real life, they looked different, more tired, more real. "You're sure just an Americano, Mr. Neo," smiled the barista, a young guy with a neon streak in his hair. Keanu met his gaze for a moment, then gave a weary smile. "I think that's exactly what I need today." The barista nodded, but said nothing more. The silent rule: don't disturb a person who comes into a cafe with a weight on their shoulders. Keanu sat in the corner by the window. He pulled a small book from his pocket, old with folded pages, and opened it where he had left off last time. He wasn't really reading. His eyes scanned the lines, but his mind was far away. He felt empty. And strangely, it was in this silence, among the scent of coffee and baked apples, that this emptiness felt the most present. Not even loneliness, an echo of something lost. And then, his gaze involuntarily stopped at the window, and something inside him stirred. On the sidewalk across the street stood a girl, small, thin, with a fluffy pom-pom on her hat that shook with every gust of wind. Her old puffer jacket was crookedly zipped, and a backpack with a patch was slipping off her shoulder. Embroidered in large letters on the patch, "Layla." She didn't move, just stared through the cafe window, directly at the dessert display. Her face was pressed against the glass, slightly fogged from her breath. Her eyes were large, deep, serious, like those of an adult who has been silent for a very long time. In her hand, several coins. She turned them over with her fingers, again and again, counting, comparing them with the handwritten price tags on 4 sheets in the window. She whispered something to herself, maybe counting, maybe praying. Keanu looked back at his coffee, at the book, but he could no longer concentrate. His eyes kept returning to the small figure outside the window, and something inside him, this tired, silent man, began to soften. Like ice cracking after the first spring sun. He didn't know yet that this girl would change his day, maybe even something more. Layla shifted from one foot to the other, then looked at the coins again, and resolutely opened the cafe door. The bell above the entrance jingled so loudly that even Keanu flinched a little. The small figure Keanu had just seen through the window appeared in the doorway. The wind suddenly burst into the cafe's warm atmosphere, tugging at Layla's scarf and tossing the pom-pom on her hat into the air. The girl took a step forward and froze for a moment. Her gaze slid across the wooden floor, the candy display table, the dessert case. and stopped at the barista. "Hi," she said, almost in a whisper, walking up to the counter. The guy with the neon streak in his hair turned around, slightly surprised, but quickly switched to a warm, gentle tone. "Hey champ, how can I help you?" Layla pulled a folded dollar bill and a few coins from her pocket, laying them out on the counter as if afraid to lose even a cent. "Excuse me, how much is the one with the strawberry?" She pointed to the bright pink cake behind the glass. The barista smiled slightly, trying to sound casual. "For you, charm discount. But still, $4.75. He winked conspiratorially. Layla lowered her eyes, sighed, and began counting the coins. $1 and then 50, 60, 75 cents. That was it. She had nothing left. The barista was silent for a moment, then took a pastry box, opened the display case, and carefully placed a slice of strawberry cake inside. "Take it. You can pay the rest some other time." "Or never," he said softly, handing over the box. His voice dropped slightly at the last word. Layla looked up at him. Her eyes were shining, but she didn't cry. She just nodded and whispered, "Thank you. Very much." She turned and left the cafe. The bell jingled again, this time softer than usual. Maybe because the door closed too slowly. Maybe because Keanu's heart was already beating a little faster. He didn't see her face at that moment, but he saw how tightly her hand clutched the box. Not like a child who had just received a long-desired treat, but like an adult holding something too precious to let go. Keanu set his coffee cup down. The book remained open, but he no longer saw a single line. He was looking out the window, and there she was again, back in his view. Layla didn't sit on the bench, didn't go to the park, didn't open the box. Instead, she headed toward a nearby street corner where, barely visible behind a billboard, sat a man. A dirty cardboard box served as his bed. A worn blanket covered his shoulders. A piece of cardboard, scribbled with shaky handwriting. "Any help. Grateful from the heart." The man didn't look around. He stared at the ground. And then, gently, almost solemnly, Layla approached and placed the cake box in front of him, as if placing it before something sacred. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a few seconds, then softly whispered something. And then something incredible happened. The man who had sat for hours with empty eyes suddenly smiled, truly smiled. His hands, trembling, black with grime, touched the box as if he were afraid it was a dream. Layla took a small step back. Her face briefly lit up with a smile, and just at that moment, she turned around, walked away, carefully, unhurriedly. She had almost disappeared around the corner when, suddenly, she stopped. Keanu saw her quickly wipe her eyes with her sleeve. Once, twice. She shook her head, as if trying to shake something off. Maybe tears, maybe pain. And then he stood up. The coffee remained untouched. He no longer needed the warmth of the drink, because something else, stronger, deeper, had already lit a fire inside him. Keanu stepped outside as if something inside had nudged him. The wind hit his face immediately, but he didn't stop. His eyes instantly found Layla. She was standing by the newspaper stand, shoulders hunched as if trying to become invisible. Her hands were in her pockets, but she held the cake box under her arm. Maybe she had taken the empty box back with her, or maybe she just couldn't leave it behind, where her heart had stayed with that man. Keanu approached slowly, carefully, not to startle her. But she noticed him anyway, out of the corner of her eye, like someone who's learned not to trust too quickly. She tensed a little, but didn't run. "Hey," he said gently, "that was a really kind thing you did. Is he a relative of yours?" Layla was silent for a moment. The wind danced around them, carrying the smell of street hot dogs and old newspapers. She looked at Keanu directly for a long time. And only when she was sure he meant it, she answered, "No." He was our neighbor. Once he showed me how to make paper planes. One of them even flew all the way to the roof of our building. We laughed so much that day. And then he got evicted. Just kicked out. Her voice cracked on the last word. She turned her face away but didn't step back. "Why the cake?" Keanu asked softly. Layla smiled faintly at the corners of her mouth, because one day, when we still lived next to him, he said he dreamed of tasting strawberry again. Real strawberry. Not fake. Sweet, like when you're a kid. I didn't get why it mattered so much back then, but now, I do. Keanu stayed silent. His fingers had gone numb, but not from the cold. It was something deeper. "I dot," Layla began, then swallowed the lump in her throat. "I save up coins every week, from my school lunch. Sometimes I skip the bun or the vending machine water. My teacher thinks I just don't like eating at school, but that's not it." She looked up. There was pride in her eyes, and shame, and something else that made Keanu feel like the ground had shifted slightly beneath him. I also leave notes in there," she added quietly. "Inside the box, so he remembers he's not alone." Keanu felt something move inside his chest. He wanted to say something, but didn't know how. Words felt too small. "And today?" he whispered. "What did you write today?" Layla blushed a little, but answered, "One day, someone will notice you, and do what I can't." After those words, a silence settled between them. Not an awkward silence, a sacred one. Keanu stood, unsure how to breathe, and Layla just looked at him, with that open honesty only children possess. And suddenly, he understood. He couldn't leave this as just a story. It was too real, too right, too alive. And in this girl, in her tears, her trembling fingers, and her notes, was something that brought back a memory of who he used to be. A boy who also wrote notes, not to someone, but to himself. So he wouldn't forget that kindness exists. The next morning, the city woke up to the same wind, the same gray fog hanging between skyscrapers like an unwanted dream. But Keanu walked the streets with a completely different feeling inside. He carried a paper bag filled with something that smelled like chicken, roasted vegetables, and warmth. In his other hand, a thermos of tea. Under his arm, a new blanket, the tag still hanging from the corner. He couldn't get Layla's words out of his head, and he didn't want to, because for the first time in a long time, something inside him had responded. Something that had been quiet for too long, shamefully quiet. Keanu turned onto the same street again, and he was still there. The man. The same gaze lowered to the ground, the same hands hidden under a blanket that didn't keep out the cold. But today, everything was about to change. Keanu approached slowly and sat down beside him. The man lifted his head, and first there was fear in his eyes, then surprise, and then recognition. "You," he whispered. "You're that actor?" Keanu gave a small smile. "Today, I'm just a man who brought you lunch. Mind if I join you?" The homeless man slowly nodded, and they sat together in silence while Keanu opened the bag, took out the steaming container, and opened the thermos. "You know," the man began, his voice raspy. "I used to teach kids how to draw, in a school. I ran an art club. We built puppet theaters out of cardboard. I had a full class, 15 kids. I still remember their names." He paused, glancing away. Then my wife passed away, and everything fell apart. The school shut down. I was evicted. I lost everything. And over time, I convinced myself that no one needed me anymore. Keanu silently handed him the tea and said only one thing. "You're needed now." The man stared at him for a long time, and finally, for the first time in a long while, his eyes didn't just water, they glowed. "You know," he whispered, "I thought those notes were from someone imaginary, a child's fantasy. But then, I started waiting for them, every week, because they were the only thing that made me feel like I was still here, still alive." Keanu nodded, and he knew he had no right to walk away without doing something. That same day, he returned to the cafe. The barista with the neon streak wasn't joking anymore. He listened seriously as Keanu explained his idea. Imagine, every customer can pay for another meal, but not just pay. Leave a note, a hope, a wish, something warm, and we'll pass it on to those who live without hope. We'll call it, I don't know, from heart to heart. The barista stopped, looking at the board behind him. Sounds good. It really does. And right. Within a few days, the cafe had a small shelf with little boxes, and next to them, cups filled with paper hearts. Anyone could pay for a meal and leave a message. At first, people felt awkward. But then, they wrote. Because everyone had something they wanted to say to someone, even if that someone was a stranger. And Layla didn't know. She kept walking her usual route, still left coins and words. But now, her small act had become a wave, and every new box with a warm meal carried the warmth of someone else's heart. Because of her. And Keanu was no longer just a bystander. He became part of the change. A week later, the rain had stopped, but autumn still breathed cold. The wind still spun leaves between buildings, but the sun broke through the clouds more often. The little cafe on the corner, still smelling of cinnamon, was living its new life. Inside, boxes, paper hearts, new faces. People came not only for coffee, but for a chance to give a piece of themselves to those who often go unnoticed. And every day, someone left a new note. A few words that could become a lifeline for someone who had long forgotten what human warmth felt like. That morning, the cafe door opened, and a familiar little figure stepped inside. Layla. The same pom-pom hat, the same backpack with the patch. She had grown a bit, or maybe she just stood straighter. Her face was as serious as always, but her eyes scanned the room attentively. The barista saw her first. He smiled like he was greeting an old friend. "Strawberry cake today, in your honor, Layla." She stopped, embarrassed. "My honor?" she asked quietly. The barista nodded toward the wall. Layla turned and froze. On the wall, where the menu used to be, were dozens, if not hundreds, of notes. Colorful, hand-drawn, typed, written on napkins, on the backs of receipts, on scraps of notebooks. They read, "Your kindness is inspiring. We see you, Layla. Thank you for reminding me that kindness is a choice." Her eyes darted across every message, her lips trembling. She couldn't believe this was all about her. And then she saw him. In the same corner, at the same table, sat Keanu, in a simple coat, holding a cup of tea. He wasn't looking at her like a star, not even like an adult, but like someone who understands, who truly sees. She walked over, hesitantly. "Was it you?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Keanu looked up at her, and in his eyes was something more than a smile. There was recognition, respect, and gratitude. "Number, it was you." They stood in silence. 1 second, 2. But in that silence was more than 1,000 words. And on the cafe window, between stickers and a garland of dried oranges, hung a new sign. Here began the story of a cake and a great heart. And beside it, a paper heart with a child's handwriting that read, "For Mr. Greg, so he won't be alone. Signed, Layla. And the world kept moving. Cars passed by, people hurried, the wind spun leaves. But in this little corner of New York, in the heart of a cafe, a new story lived, about a child who expected nothing, and a man who couldn't stay indifferent, and about a kindness that began with a single slice of strawberry cake. Sometimes the most powerful changes in life begin with a very quiet gesture. A little girl who gave up her cake for someone else. A man who saw more than just a child's action. And a world that responded, not with applause, but with a reply. This story isn't about a star or a cafe. It's about how one sincere act can spark a chain of kindness. How even the smallest gesture, giving up a pastry, leaving a note, looking at someone with respect, can become someone's first taste of warmth in a long time. Each of us has the power to be that someone who notices, who does what others won't, not because we have to, but because it's a choice, a human, honest, real choice. If today you see someone who's struggling, remember Layla, and ask yourself, what would I do? Because the world doesn't change through loud words. It changes through quiet hearts that don't look away. Be sure to share your impressions of the story in the comments and write what conclusions you have drawn after listening to it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I wish you all a good mood and see you in the new video tomorrow.